We are coming back for our second session, and so we are a bit in late respect our timeline, but I think we'll have a few more time for during the second session, also for a short break. And so I'm very glad to start this second session. At the beginning of this webinar, we already introduced the topic and the and the different guests that we are going to have in the second session of the morning. And the topic, the general topic, is about social innovation and urban heritage. And so I don't want to take much more time, and so I'm going to introduce Megan Sharkey, which is a researcher, scholar at the University of Westminster in the UK, and a lecturer at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and she is right now in Australia. And so I'm very glad to have you here, and so I leave you the stage, and so to you, and when you want, you can share your screen. And so we start with the first presentation of the second session.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I have to say, a few of you look very warm, and I'm very cold at the moment. This is a very cold day, so I'm a bit jealous. I'll just share my screen. Excellent. Can you see that?
Yes, right now.
Great. So today I'm talking about sort of an extension of my PhD research. I've been finalizing my thesis the last couple of months for submission, as well as doing a few other different sort of projects. And what keeps coming up for me, I was living in London. I left because of COVID and moved back to Australia. So there's been these sort of two very different response experiences in relation to transitions and how that has impacted different aspects of urban regeneration. And so today I wanted to talk about some of my sort of perceptions and what is happening, and some, I guess, research agenda of what's happening next. So the sort of three main questions that I'm going to talk about today is: how has COVID impacted active transport transitions in the UK and Australia? Sort of what are some of these implications for urban regeneration? And what role has grassroots movements played a role in this transition? So my research was looking at how grassroots movements can accelerate transition, particularly with cycling, active travel, and other health impacts in transport. So I won't go into too much detail of this, but this is the framework that I've been using for my own research. So doing initiative-based learning. I've been an action researcher, activist researcher, working with a number of grassroots groups, both in London for my own research and recently in Australia. Then this aspect of socio-technical transitions, which I'll highlight more today, is, you know, what are the social impacts in terms of the technical transitions we want to get to sustainability. And then the third element is what is that sort of quantitative modeling we would do to then enable these faster. And I'll come back to this at the end. So as we are all sort of aware, COVID has impacted a number of social changes of transitions. From this perspective, it was around it started here with this left, right? For community safety, we needed to encourage physical distancing. So what did this actually mean? Well, it impacted public transport capacity, movement patterns in the city, indoor capacity of businesses, and physical activity capability of individual residents. And so cities responded in a number of different ways. As some of you might have seen, reallocation of streets from motor vehicles to walking and cycling, the institution of outdoor dining, pop-up infrastructure, and rapid rollout of this. And what I think is important here is that in terms of these grassroots groups I'm going to talk about, they've experienced a lot of resistance to doing these different things. And COVID necessitated that change from a physical distance, which in some ways broke down barriers, but obviously had a lot of other sort of impacts. So what does this actually look like? And I'm going to go in detail with the UK and London, and some of the things that I've noted, as well as some of the things I have researched and am currently doing research on. So in the UK and London, there has been more than 100 kilometers of pop-up cycleways. So these sort of little pictures here on the bottom left, where they've effectively just put in pop-up bollards that can be removable. There's been a huge and outdoor dining. There's been these, if you look at the sort of top right, what we call modal filters and additional seating. And these have been placed across all of London. So hundreds of kilometers of quieter streets, extended pavement, new school streets, increase, so if you see here, increase in planter boxes, as well as a massive amounts of funding investment in terms of public space and active transport across the city, as well as the UK. And this has also impacted pedestrian and cyclist deaths. So we're looking at a reduction in killed and seriously injured compared to 2019. So this was some research I did over the last year. And what we looked at was, what were the equity implications of this pop-up infrastructure across London? So we looked at everywhere where there were low traffic neighborhoods, where there was pop-up cycleways, where there were sort of street side eateries, low traffic neighborhoods, modal filters, and mapped them, which you can see as these sort of darker shades. And I should say this data was only, for this particular paper, was from March of 2020 to November 2020. So obviously it doesn't include the last 6 months. And we looked at various social demographic factors. We looked at council housing. We looked at a variety of sort of Bay and lower socio-demographics, a number of different indicators. And what we found was that actually across London, people in deprived area were much more likely to live in or near an area with an LTN, and an area where these interventions were actually taking place. And what is important about that, I think from a few different aspects, was these areas, and this is sort of a second research area we're looking at now, have historically had high levels of pollution, high levels of motor traffic, lower housing values, less greenery, and a number of other factors. So we first looked at sort of the equity implications, and what that might, and then I think the second stage of that is, what might that mean for actual urban regeneration if these interventions are maintained over the long term. In the short term, it has meant that more people are actually able to walk and cycle in those areas, and actually have different methods of transport in lieu of public transport, or increased ability to go somewhere else. So in another area, this is Hackney, which is an inner city suburb of London. And it was also next to one of my research groups that I worked with during my PhD. And residents were 18.3% more likely to live in a new LTN or near a modal filter. And what I like about Hackney was, so in the bottom right corner, you see the mayor, John Burke. He was a really big proponent of, and is, around greening different neighborhoods. And so his strategy intentionally targeted areas that had underinvestment and utilized the pop-up infrastructure grant money that he could get from Transport for London, as well as the federal government, to target areas where there had been underinvestment, and tried to leverage that with additional funds. So in this top image, you can see this is a street called Broadway. It's got a very high sort of mixed use area, lots of renters, lots of council housing estate. And it was also one of the main traffic thoroughfares. So people who use that road didn't actually live there. And so now, when they've done recent surveying, most of the people who are using this space now are those who actually live locally. So they're being able to occupy, and there's tactical urbanistas. I liked from the previous presentation because there's people who are doing like pop-up coffee and all of the sort of other things that they didn't previously have access to. Now, I'm going to move on to Australia in a minute, but I think in the context of UK, and I should note, this is a question that I've been asking myself, and I'm going to do some research on, is what impact the COVID death and infections have had on this sort of pop-up infrastructure and urban regeneration, but it's not something I'm talking about here. But a key difference from what's happened in the UK and what's happened in London is that there's been a bigger coalition support. So in this was a research group that I had been working with and had developed a template for change. And they have effectively enabled bigger coalition groups to support the infrastructure that's being driven. And that this has had the impact of, in historical and sort of political areas where there's been a lot of opposition, a recent election in the last 2 months actually showed a massive drop in those parties because they campaigned against this anti-LTNs, these anti-pop-ups, this anti-public space. And they had the largest drop in votes ever recorded, and actually that the political parties who were pro these things had a massive increase. So there's sort of the coalition support in those targeted areas, and the how those coalitions and these grassroots groups, so these are being led by Better Streets and Living Streets and a massive amount of volunteers, is actually having a positive impact on changing the political landscape towards active transport infrastructure, as well as there's been a number of sort of equity BAME groups and council housing estates that have backed these initiatives as positive for their environment. So I'm really interested to see where that goes and what the permanent aspects of that might be. Which leads me to what's happened in Australia. So as I mentioned earlier, I was doing my PhD in London for a variety of reasons, with family, having small kids and visas expiring. I had to return to Australia. So in Australia, I launched what was Space for Health. So I took the work I was doing in London and said, why aren't we doing something here? We're having some of the similar issues. It coordinated with a variety of researchers. And so over 100 Australian health and transport experts issued a call for space for walking and cycling. And this generated some national and local news. And so the Department of Planning enacted Streets for Shared Spaces. So sort of months and months behind what the UK was doing. And in contrast to the UK, that did a $250 million fund nationally, plus millions more in London, and sort of a 5-year, $2 billion plan. In New South Wales, where Sydney's located, they did a $15 million grant fund, which funded 52 temporary demonstration and pilot projects. And then individual councils have to decide whether to make them permanent. This also had a much lower kilometers. We're talking 28 kilometers sort of across New South Wales, which obviously is much lower than the other bit. So there were we did very similar things. I should say ours were, in contrast to the UK, there was more steps to jump through around, like here you can see the concrete barriers. These wands, there was a lot of debate. They put them in and they took them out. So there was a lot of hesitation to do this sort of infrastructure. And only one of them is being made permanent. But ironically, it will only be made permanent after 2 years of further pilot intervention, even though this is the #1 cycleway used across the city. Which leads me to the second point around, well, is it actually equitable? So I think a big contrast I've noticed from London to Sydney is that it isn't equitable. And some initial research is showing that even though there's been a great increase in the pop-ups they've done, they've been primarily in very affluent areas and connected to the commercial centers, and have not taken any targeted equity approach. So you can see here, these are all of Sydney pop-ups, but actually Sydney looks like this. So if you can see here, here's where all the pop-ups, and this is the most affluent area, but actually in this area where we have Parramatta, Liverpool, Blacktown, the Western Sydney Parklands, is where we primarily have quite a large of our not only immigrant population, but where our social housing. They also have within here in this sort of area just here between Parramatta and Liverpool, they actually have the least amount of access to public parks and least amount of access to public transport and higher unemployment rates. So it's an area that these things are needed more than in sort of the inner city, where actually we have access to a lot of stuff. We have access to the beaches. And when this was spoken about within sort of, I guess, in the media and in others, there was just really no focus. All they really focused on was the CBD. We need to fix the CBD. But actually the CBD in Sydney is one of the places that need the urban regeneration, that need it less.
1 minute left. 1 minute left.
Sure. So this is another example with Kuje Bay Road, really popular, but 95% of response were local. They wanted it, but council voted to remove. And I think the key thing was there was no coalition advocating for permanency. They had the contrast of being mostly COVID-free, even though they had lots and lots of different lockdowns. So there was no urgency. Very similar to Melbourne as well. They've done a few pop-ups, but rather than the 100 Ks they announced, they've built less than 10, and there's been no coalition. So Eurobike is a group I've been working with. They're one of the only ones, but they don't actually have a coalition or any sort of groundswell support. So I'm really curious to see, this was an aspect of my research, how will this transition actually impact? So the blue line doesn't mean that it'll accelerate towards movement goals. What might that look like? And then in contrast, for some future research questions we're exploring is what impact did the level of infections and death have on the government response, and what might this be for long-term changes? How has activism in the local area supported the COVID intervention measures? It seems across the UK that the more activism in local areas, the bigger the impact on keeping them permanent has been. Will the equity implications continue, and what will it look like if we make it permanent? And how has it reduced air pollution? How has government used existing infrastructure differently rather than building new infrastructure? So will they keep these pop-ups and allow the space to grow, or will they remove them and then take years for planning? And then the last one is sort of how do we get better at engaging with these transitions and actually engaging with policy during these sort of impact events during transitions. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you. I'll stop sharing.
Many thanks, Megan, for this very nice presentation and for giving us this background about UK and Australia, especially in this period.